All right, everyone, this is open source standards and IP strategy. I'll talk to you today a little bit about open source standards and how they impact your IP portfolio. First, let's talk about the changing IP landscape. For decades, patent strategy was simple: invent, file, protect. But innovation no longer happens behind closed doors. Today, it's built on shared code bases, open standards, and global collaboration. From AI frameworks to wireless protocols, the most transformative technologies are born in ecosystems where sharing is the rule, not the exception. That reality is changing how corporations think about IP because while open source and standards can accelerate innovation, they also raise complex questions. Like, first, what happens to your IP rights when you contribute to open source? When does participation in the standard mean you've committed to license or forego your core technology? And how do you protect competitive advantage while still being part of the innovation conversation? Today, we're going to unpack all of that, exploring how open source and standards intersect with patent strategy and how smart portfolio management can balance collaboration with control. First, let's talk about the rise of the open ecosystems. Let's start with the big picture. The shift toward open innovation isn't optional anymore, it's structural. Almost every major technology company now contributes to open source projects, from Google with TensorFlow to Microsoft with VS Code to chip makers like Intel and RISC-V. In parallel, industries are converging around standard bodies, 3GPP, IEEE, ISO, that define how devices, systems, and networks talk to each other. These open ecosystems speed up development and interoperability, but they come with a trade-off. The more open the collaboration, the blurrier the line between proprietary and public IP. And that's where many companies stumble, not in innovation itself, but in managing how openness interacts with ownership. Because the question isn't just, should we contribute to open source? The real question is, how do we contribute strategically without unintentionally giving away our crown jewels? Next, let's talk about understanding open source licensing and IP implications. To make that strategic, we need to talk about licensing. There are hundreds of open source licenses out there, but they broadly fall into two philosophical families. First, the permissive licenses, and second, the copyright licenses. The permissive licenses include familiar licenses such as MIT, Apache 2.0, BSD. These allow broad reuse, including in commercial products, as long as attribution is maintained and liability is disclaimed. Patents can still exist under these licenses, but Apache 2.0, for example, includes an explicit patent grant. That means if you contribute code under Apache 2.0, you are granting recipients a license to any patents that read on that contribution. The copyleft licenses, these require derivative works to be distributed under the same license. That's viral in effect, meaning if your proprietary product integrates GPL licensed code, you might have to open your own source. So a key part of open source governance is knowing which license you're contributing under and whether it carries a patent exhaustion or a patent grant clause. For example, under Apache 2.0, if you later sue someone for patent infringement based on technology included in your contribution, your own licenses can be terminated. That's not theoretical. It's happened. So the strategic takeaway: open source partnership requires not just legal review, but patent portfolio mapping, knowing exactly which one of your filings overlap with open code. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about standards participation in FRAND licensing. Now let's move on from open source to standards. Standards bodies like 3GPP or IEEE or ITU or W3C are the backbone of interoperability. They make sure 5G devices talk to each other, or Wi-Fi routers work across bands, and web browsers read the same HTML. But they also create one of the most complex intersections between patents and public access through standard essential patents, or SEPs. If your technology becomes part of a standard, you may be required to license it under FRAND terms, which are fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. That's good for global compatibility, but it also means you can't enforce the patent freely anymore. For corporations, that's a double-edged sword. Being part of a standard can make your IP extremely valuable, but it can also limit exclusivity and invite regulatory scrutiny. So the strategic balance is between influence and independence. You want to shape the standard, but you also need to know when your participation triggers licensing commitments. And those commitments can follow you globally, across jurisdictions, for decades. Companies that fail to track their standard essential contributions often end up in disputes, not because they filed the wrong patent, but because they didn't realize what it became part of. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about the portfolio impact when open source meets patents. Let's connect the dots. Open source, standards, and patents don't live in separate silos. They constantly interact and sometimes collide. Here's the risk matrix we often see. An engineer contributes to an open source repo containing technology described in a pending application. The company later asserts that patent, only to find out that contribution contributed a broad license under Apache 2.0, or a technology disclosed in the standards proposal later became part of the spec, binding the patent to FRAND terms. In both cases, the company didn't lose because of bad IP, it lost because of bad coordination. Reactive filing teams often don't know what's being shared. Proactive IP teams create a governance loop connecting engineering, open source, and legal workflows in real time. In short, you can't protect what you can't see. And in open ecosystems, visibility is everything. Next, I want to talk to you about the governance frameworks for open IP strategy. So how do you operationalize this? How do large companies build an IP framework that supports openness and protection? It starts with 3 pillars of governance. First, visibility. Second, classification. And third, cross-functional review. Let's talk about visibility. You need tools and processes that track contributions, both internal and external. Every engineer's GitHub comment, every standard submission, every open source dependency should be visible to the IP team. Next, let's talk about classification. Not all contributions are equal. Some can be open source safely, others touch core proprietary technology. So we should define tiers. For example, tier 1, non-core, free, shareable. Tier 2, peripheral innovations with internal review. And then tier 3, your core algorithm. This requiring IP clearance before any contributions. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about cross-functional review. The best programs have a joint review team, legal, engineering, and product, that evaluates open source participation before code goes public. They maintain an internal open source registry and tie it to the patent docket, so you always know what's been filed, published, or licensed. That kind of infrastructure doesn't just prevent mistakes, it turns open collaboration into a strategic differentiator. Because companies that manage open IP well don't slow innovation, they scale it safely. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about strategic filing in open ecosystems. Now, let's talk about filing strategy itself. In an open environment, filing early and filing selectively becomes critical. Why? Because once something's released into open source, it becomes prior art. You can't later patent what's already public. So timing is everything. Proactive filings integrate patent review into their release cycle. Before any major contribution, they run a quick check process. 1, does this code or technology overlap with any pending or planned patents? Second, should we file a provisional before releasing it? Third, should we license or disclaim specific elements to protect the broader IP? This kind of file then share rhythm keeps innovation open while preserving rights. It also helps in standard participation. If your technology may be proposed for standardization, filing before disclosure ensures you can later license under FRAND from a position of ownership. That's the subtle art of open filing. Filing not to fence off the field, but to plant your flag before the field becomes common ground. Now I want to talk to you about balancing collaboration and control. The key takeaway here isn't to avoid open source or standards, it's to engage intelligently. Companies that isolate themselves lose relevance, but companies that open up without governance lose control. The sweet spot is strategic openness, where contribution is intentional, IP is coordinated, and participation strengthens rather than weakens your portfolio. That's what I call the controlled collaboration model. You're not locking your IP away, you're orchestrating how it connects with the world. So in closing, I want to talk to you a little bit about the future of IP in an open world. Let's close with this thought. Open source and standards are not IP's enemies, they are the new environments in which IP must live. In the 20th century, competitive advantage came from owning technology, but in the 21st century, it comes from owning your position within a shared ecosystem. Your patent portfolio is still your moat, but now it has gates, bridges, and shared roads. Managing those connections transparently and strategically is the new frontier of corporate IP. So, as your teams contribute code, shape standards, and collaborate globally, remember, every line of open source, every standard submission, every license choice is an IP decision. The companies that understand that early will lead not just in innovation, but in influence. Because in a world built on open innovation, the most valuable position isn't ownership or access, it's mastery of both.